Today we are going to be building an Arcbotics Hexy leg. As you can see, I have already built one here. I've actually built a second one as well. And I'm going to build the third one now. I have the directions on my phone so that we can view the PDF while we're going through this. And in order to start, what we're going to need is we are going to need one bag of Hexy leg parts. We are also going to need 3 of the servotors as well. In addition, you will need a small screwdriver. I got this at Maplin Electronics as part of a much larger kit, which was fairly inexpensive. And you will also need the battery housing and ideally 4 charged nickel metal hydride rechargeable batteries. And you are also going to need the controller board for centering the servos when we do that. So the first step in actually doing this is to get the various pieces out of their bags. Once that is done, we are going to actually peel the stickers off the various leg pieces, which I find to be the most tedious part of this, but it has to be done. So I'm going to go ahead and go through that right now. So once you have the servos and the leg pieces out, you'll notice that the various leg pieces have brown sticky paper on them. We are going to take the brown sticky paper off first. You're probably going to want to have long nails for this because this is very difficult to do if you do not. I hope that in the future the Arcbotics Hexy people will actually provide some kind of a tab so that this can be pulled off more easily, because it does take a few minutes just to get all this paper off. So as you can see, once the paper comes off, the blue piece is actually what it looks like when you are going to have your final robot assembled. As you can see, it is quite tedious to get this paper off. So that's the first piece. So I lay the pieces out as they are in the instructions, in addition to getting rid of the various pieces of paper at the same time. So right now what I am laying out are the foot parts. Once we can get these pieces of paper off. There. Then we need the roundest piece of all, which is the most difficult, because there are no corners. The instructions actually say to catch a corner of the piece and to pull the paper off, but of course with round pieces there aren't any corners. So okay, so now we have all of the pieces disassembled, or I should say unwrapped from the brown sticky paper, though I will probably speed this up on the film. 8 minutes have already gone by, so you should expect that it will take you approximately that long to get all of the brown sticky paper off all of the pieces. But now we're actually going to go ahead and assemble the first, or third, in this case, robot leg. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow the instructions to the letter. So now that we have all of the pieces, we're going to start with this one. This is the one into which the first 2 servos will go. So servo goes into the servo selector so that it looks like this. You'll notice that the actual servo pieces are at each end, and once we've done that, we are going to flip the piece over, and we are going to take the items that look like little ladders, and we are going to slot each one right next to a servo. You'll notice that there is a space in the middle, or there should be a space in the middle anyway. Once we have that space in the middle, we are then going to take this piece here and we are going to slot it into place. Maybe a little tricky because the pieces don't exactly stay just yet, but you should be able to slot it into place so that you now have the piece looking like this. So you can turn it over, you can see. Once we've done that, we're going to take one of the long screws from the bag of provided screws and we're going to thread it through the bottom so that it comes out in the piece that we have just added. So now we have a screw coming through from the bottom, and we're going to affix that with a nut. So you can find these all in the included bag of screws. So once we have our screw into place, we can then go ahead and hold the nut steady and screw this into place. So that's actually the first step. So now we have two servos and the accompanying wires, and they are held into place, as you can see, with the screw and the nut. So if we look at the next set of directions, the next set of directions suggests that we put that aside for just a second, and we start with the foot. So we need the foot piece as well as the rubber tip, and these just go together fairly easily. There's nothing that you have to slot into place or anything, it just fits right on. Then we are going to add the Y piece onto the foot. So the Y piece looks like this. You'll notice that there is a slot in it, and the slot is so that we can slot it into place, but also below that there is a screw hole. So you want to make sure that these two pieces line up. So once we have them lined up, they will look like that. You'll notice now also that there is what looks like a space for a screw and a nut, and that is exactly what's going to happen. So we're going to take a screw out of the bag, or sorry, a nut out of the bag, and we're going to place it in the little slot where it indicates the nut should go. And that's actually a little bit more difficult than it looks like, because you have to kind of rest it in sideways so that when we push the screw through, it will then slide into place. But if you'll notice, it is possible to do. So then we hold, it is possible to do, but difficult to film because the thing wants to jump out. But anyway, once we do that, we have it in place. You can hold it in place with your thumb. And you take the screw, the medium screw, and you slot it through and screw it into place. So now what we're doing is we are forcing the screw through the nut that we have just added. So you'll see now that the screw and the nut are in place, and we can screw it together tightly. So that's the next step completed. So now we have our foot with the Y piece attached. And the next step is to use what they call a servo, servo horn, as they call it, servo horn. So there are several of these that come in each of the servo bags. You'll notice that they each have little screws in them as well. The screws that are in this bag we will not be using. They suggest not to use those screws, but what we will be using is a straight servo horn. And a straight servo horn looks like this. It has a holding piece in it. You should be able to see that there is a space where things would go in, whereas the other side is just completely flat. And we're going to use the small screws from the regular bag of provided screws. Now, this servo horn has several holes in it. Looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 holes on each side. You are going to use the second from the end on both sides when you work with this particular servo horn, and that's the case for this step as well as future steps. So what I like to do is I like to actually take the small screws out of the bag. These are the tiny ones that they provide, and I like to actually press them into place so that we can make our lives easier, because it's very difficult to hold this piece in place while trying to screw the screws into the little holes. So again, I'm using the second from the end in each case, and I'm going to put a screw on each side. This is slightly difficult because these screws were not designed for this particular servo horn, but as they suggest, using the bigger screws instead of the small screws that they originally provided will actually make your life easier in the future. It also suggests that when you're doing this, that the servo horn may crack a little, and that it is actually okay for that to happen. I have not experienced that yet in the two that I have built. Right now I have my servo horn with 2 screws. You'll notice that the screws are on the same side as the servo horn holding area, so that everything that's not flat is on one side, whereas the other side is completely flat. So we're going to take that and our Y piece, we're going to place it over the Y piece, and we are going to screw it into the Y piece so that everything is on the inside. You'll notice, of course, that having put the screws into place sooner rather than later does make this significantly easier. We can actually just screw them into place in one step. I like to do a little bit on each side just so that I'm not moving the servo horn out of whack and then having to move it back into place. So once that's done, we now have our foot with the Y piece and the servo horn connected to it. So the next step is going to be connecting a battery holder to the servos and the board. So you'll notice that we have the control board, and on the control board there are a number of connections on either side, as well as 2 power connectors. Very important to note, and they don't note this in the instructions, is that this power connector is for powering these connections here. This power connector is for powering these connections here. So if you plug something into this one and attempt to use these, nothing is going to happen. So we're going to take our batteries. Batteries are previously charged. It takes about maybe an hour or so to charge all 4 of the batteries. And we're going to connect the board to the battery. You'll notice that when the board gets connected, there's a brief red light and then a green light. That's exactly what the instructions suggest will happen. So I can go ahead and connect that. There's our red light, and now we have a steady green light. The steady green light indicates that the board is powered correctly. So now I'm going to place this on the table, and I'm going to actually connect the servo to the board. So you'll notice that we have our servo connection here. It has an orange, red, and brown wire. The brown wire needs to be towards the edge of the board, but can be plugged into either 0, 1, 2, or 3 connector on the board in order to center the servo so that everything is assembled centered. So I'm going to go ahead and connect that now. And once I do that, you'll hear that whirring. That whirring has just centered the servo into place, which is what we'll need. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the other one. So I'm going to go ahead and do that again. You'll hear that whirring again. That whirring indicates that this has indeed been centered correctly. So what we're going to do now that we have done that is we are going to go ahead and align the calf and thigh sections as straight as possible, and then we're going to put this into the servo horn. So we're going to connect this piece with the Y to the actual leg piece that we built earlier. So we're going to go ahead and do that. They suggest that you actually maintain the connection to the board while doing that so that everything is centered, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So I'm going to connect this now, and then we will screw it into place. What it was this. I will disconnect it from the power source, make sure that it is straight. Once it's on, you can reconnect it, again putting the brown wire to the end. Making sure that it is straight, and then once it's straight I can connect it with the screw So let's try that again. We put it on. Okay, got it centered. So now I am going to screw it into place. Easier to put the screw on the end of the screwdriver and slot it in. And now we have the foot piece connected to the leg piece, centered and correctly adjusted with the servo on. So the next step is that we can then go ahead and add in the other side, the other connection, to make sure that this side is connected as well. You'll notice that there is a gap there. So we are going to use the next piece, which is this piece here. You'll notice that this piece has a slot and two small screw holes. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to actually add a screw into the top screw hole, which is the furthest one from the slot. And we're going to put a nut on that. We're going to use a medium screw. So we drop that into place. And then we're going to use a nut on that. So if we go ahead and put the nut on, we can get it to go all the way down. Screw it into place slightly. So now we have our piece with the screw and the nut attached. And this is going to connect to the leg on this side. So once we actually do that, we will then have something that looks like that. So again, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be placing a nut into the little section that looks like it should have a nut right here. And again, it's going to be a little difficult because we have to kind of put our thumb on the other side so that it doesn't slide out. But once we do that, we take a medium screw and we put it through the second slot into the nut and then screw it into place. Once we do that, we will have the leg completely assembled. Well, I should say the lower leg completely assembled. So we tighten the screws on both sides, and now we have a leg with the two servos and the foot. So now we're going to start working on the hip. And the hip is comprised of 4 pieces. This is the first one we're going to start with. You'll notice that this particular piece also has a small hole or a partial hole right here. This is an engraved hole, as it says in the instructions. That has to be facing inwards when you work with this piece. So I'm going to go ahead and slot the first piece into place, which is this piece right here. And this piece gets slotted directly into there, as shown, so that now we have that sticking out. And as with many of the other pieces, we're going to once again put it into place with a nut and a screw. Again, keeping the nut from falling out with our finger. We will then use a medium screw to put this set of pieces together. So we drop the nut into place and thread the screw through the hole into the nut, which is a little difficult, but can be done. And once we have it screwed into place, the two pieces will of course be together. So once we've done that, we are going to take another straight servo horn. You'll have to go into a bag each time you want one of these. But once you take it out, again, same thing as before. We are going to make sure that we put 2 of the screws, the small screws from the bag, into this rather than the screws that are provided with it. And we're going to use the second hole from the end on both sides. This is of course a little tricky, but once we can get the pieces in, we can get them screwed in. So let's go ahead and do that. And we need this second piece. These are easy to drop, of course, being so small. So second from the end, once again, place the screw in, get it to go in the middle there, and then we can screw it in a little bit. And then once we have our servo horn set up, we are going to attach it to the piece that we just built.